Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to continue my teach-ins on Ukraine as we mark today, February 24th, 2023, the one-year anniversary of the incursion into Ukraine by Russia 1 year ago today to secure eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine as a land bridge to Crimea, which Russia seized in 2014. I think the one point that overrides all other points, whatever you think happened, is the very stark reality that 1 year on, what is happening is a mobilization for war between the superpowers. This has not happened since the 1930s. And if you connect World War I to World War II, this hasn't happened since about 1912, 1913, as the great powers at that time, Germany, France, Russia, Britain, Italy, the Ottoman Empire, lumbered into war that changed human history, left 10 million dead, and because they didn't resolve it at the Treaty of Versailles that began at the end of the war in 1918, Germany was wounded in its national pride and began to mobilize for another war, this time in partnership with the Japanese in the Far East, a war that again dragged in Russia, Britain, France, Italy, United States in another conflagration, the Second World War that left over 50 million people dead. And here we are, 2023, the United States and Russia and China are mobilizing for escalating war. The situation cannot be more dangerous. It's easily the most dangerous period in our lifetime, far more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. We are confronting a leadership in our political arena that seems unaware that the consequences of a conflict between three superpowers can only have a catastrophic consequence. There is no other way to put it. That if we persist in this war in Ukraine, we're going to blow ourselves up. We're going to go to a nuclear exchange. And simultaneously, we will have made impossible any cooperation between the nations to solve the real issue that is confronting humanity, and that is ecological turbulence, runaway climate change, and escalating extreme weather events that are affecting everybody around the world. And yet, tragically, everybody is cheering this war. It's extraordinary. The control of the government and the military-industrial complex is so complete that day in and day out, we're told a single narrative that Russia invaded Ukraine to seize Ukraine and take over parts of Eastern Europe as Putin, in a delusional megalomania, seeks to recreate Mother Russia and the Soviet Empire and begin to reign supreme like the czars. Nothing could be further than the truth. The truth is that this isn't a war between Ukraine fighting off the Russian invaders. This is a war between the United States and Russia, using Ukraine as a proxy army. And the United States is going to fight to the last Ukrainian. It has done it before. And it's doing it again. And it's our lack of appreciation of the reality that it is the United States that's the aggressor here, not Russia, that constitutes the major part of our predicament. I've done a number of teach-ins. I've explained the history as somebody who was intimately involved with the Soviet Politburo during the 1980s, during the time when Gorbachev was making his overtures to the United States and to the West, and proposed that the Cold War had become completely dysfunctional. The superpowers were armed to the teeth against each other on hair trigger alerts. And he said, this is crazy. We have to design a better future. What about if the Soviet Union, Russia in effect, withdraws from Eastern Europe, and the United States and NATO promises not to move to the East, and we take this as an opportunity to create a unified economic and security zone that would combine Western Europe and Eastern Europe and Russia to make a common democratic zone that could trigger a global civilization. That was Gorbachev's vision. And I know that to be true because I was there. And then the Soviet Union broke up in late 1991. And rather than helping the Russians, the neoconservatives in the United States thought, aha, now's our chance. We can break Russia, maybe even break it up. And they began a process, starting with President Clinton, and then President Bush, and then President Obama, to take NATO to the East, seize essentially Eastern Europe for the United States and NATO, and force Russia into a defensive position. And finally, in 2008, after President Bush Jr. announced that having taken all of Eastern Europe, the United States was going to take Ukraine next, President Putin and the Russians said, no, this is an existential threat. And if you do that, we're going to retake Crimea. And that's essentially what's happening. If you understand the history, what is taking place now in Ukraine, which is so clear 1 year on, is that the irresistible force of American expansion has met the immovable object of Russian nationalism. Russia is taking its last stand. It has to have Crimea and a link to Russia to secure access to the Black Sea and the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. For the United States and NATO to cut that off and take NATO all the way to the border of Russia by taking over all of Ukraine is basically to emasculate Russia. And that's why in my last teaching, I talked about empathy. You know, it's like the blind people and the elephant. We in the West, through the propaganda machine that is churning 24/7, 365, we have one story. The Russians have another story. The Ukrainians have still a third story. And it's only if we honor the multiplicity of perspectives here and understand that Putin is not some delusional megalomaniac. He's doing what any Russian leader would do in the face of a hostile and aggressive military alliance backed up by the greatest power in the history of the world, the United States, is coming after them, taking all the land that Gorbachev and the Russians voluntarily, non-violently conceded in 1990, 1991, assuming that the United States would honor its agreements. It did not. And the result of all that is Ukraine. And if Vladimir Putin does not secure Crimea and the land bridge, he goes down in Russian history as Putin, the great failure who lost Crimea. If he can secure this, he goes down as Putin the Great. At that moment, the Russians stood firm. It's very important, everyone, on this first anniversary to understand the Russian perspective. Russia has never invaded the West. But in 1812, Napoleon and the French sought to destroy Russia by invading. And the Russians actually burned Moscow to deprive Napoleon of food and shelter. And eventually the French army retreated in defeat and Napoleon was overthrown. In 1941, the Germans attacked Russia with an intent to destroy Russia. And at the great battles of Leningrad and Stalingrad in particular, the Russians stood firm. And finally, the Germans were forced to defeat. And Hitler blew his brains out in April of 1945. And the Russian army swept through Eastern Europe to secure a buffer zone so that Germany would never rise again. But Gorbachev was such a visionary that he said, we're willing to take the first step. We'll withdraw from Eastern Europe. We'll disband the Warsaw Treaty Organization, the military alliance through which the Soviet Union consolidated power in Eastern Europe. We'll allow the Eastern Europeans to be independent again. And that was the offer that Gorbachev made. One of the most extraordinary risks and diplomatic initiatives, certainly in modern history, that could have set up the basis for a security zone from Gibraltar to Vladivostok, including the United States and Canada. What an extraordinary vision that was. And it was the United States that refused and insisted on a military domination of Eastern Europe. And now, from the Russian point of view, having allowed all that to happen, including the reuniting of Germany, are taking their last stand. They're standing up against the Americans in Crimea and with the land bridge they've taken, as they've stood against the Germans and the French before. This is the third great attempt of the West to destroy Russia, and it's going to fail. Russia will endure. And we just need to understand that. And we need to understand something more deeply about Ukraine. In 2008, when President Bush announced that the United States was also going to seize Ukraine and bring it into NATO, what did Putin say? Listen, Ukraine should be neutral. And at that time, Russia was happy just to have access to Crimea, which has been worked out. The Russians have basically controlled Ukraine and Crimea since 1783. It's a very long time. Russia was born in Ukraine. The Ukrainians and the Russians were born together in Kievan Rus in the late 9th century. And Kievan Rus was the original kingdom, the original empire, actually, that evolved eventually into Russia and was located initially in Ukraine. Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe. Ukraine is the mother of Europe in a very profound way. Obviously, Ukraine should be neutral, and Russia should have free access. The Ukrainians and the Russians are siblings. They're brothers, they're sisters. They originated together. It's sacred land. But the United States wouldn't accept anything but the complete seizure of Eastern Europe, and is thereby making the most catastrophic mistake in modern history. Just imagine for a moment what the world would be like if the United States had embraced Gorbachev's proposal and we had constructed something like the European Union that encompassed Western, Eastern Europe and Russia into a single zone. World history would have been completely different. We've ended up in war because the United States refused to honor its agreement with Gorbachev. And everybody needs to understand that. And in so doing, we've desecrated the womb of Europe, the mother of Europe, and forced the Russians into taking a last stand. The solution is a ceasefire and the beginning of diplomacy. All these countries have fought amongst each other. All these countries have negotiated truces. We can do it again. Because if we don't, we're going to lumber, just like the great powers did in World War I. We're going to lumber into a war, but now it's going to have a nuclear ending that could destroy us all. And we all need to take this in. We're in an extraordinarily dangerous moment. And this is time to look beyond the mass hysteria around supporting Ukraine to fight the Russians as if we're defending civilization, when in reality, the United States is engaging in an egregious act of aggression. And the rest of the world basically understands that, except for Western Europe and North America, which is basically controlled media. But Russia, China, India, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Brazil, South Africa, more and more countries are refusing to engage in the sanctions. They're not criticizing Russia. They understand that Russia is taking a stand against U.S. aggression. And that is the basic reality that all of us need to understand. And it is out of that understanding that the most essential ingredient to a solution after we have a ceasefire is the United States needs to stand down. Look at the map. Russia has simply secured its land bridge. That's all. Ukraine, Russia, that were born together, need to be left alone in a greater Ukraine that's neutral, that could model an EU 2.0. If the world would just withdraw the weapons from Ukraine and let the Ukrainians and the Russians sort out what it is that they need to do together, having endured as neighbors, brothers, sisters, and friends for over 1,000 years. I am completely confident that they can do that. And until 2014, when the United States engineered a coup in Ukraine and overthrew a leadership that had embraced neutrality and brought in an anti-Russian, pro-US, pro-NATO regime that immediately started to fight the Russian communities in the Donbass and eastern Ukraine. Russia and Ukraine had civil relations and were perfectly capable of working things out. So obviously the Ukrainians need their sovereignty, and it's just worth noting as we think about that very precious region for Europe as the womb, that Ukraine means border. It means crossroad. That's what the word means. It's a part of a vast steppe, and empires and kingdoms and peoples and traders and spiritual traditions have crisscrossed Ukraine for thousands of years. And that's why it never became a country. Ukraine actually did not become an independent country until 1991. It's one of the newest countries in the world. Of course, it needs its sovereignty. Even with what Russia has taken, which is now Russia. It's been annexed into Russia, and that's not going to change. Ukraine is still the largest country in Europe. It has its own access to the Black Sea through Odessa. If the United States would stand down and NATO and the United States would withdraw from Ukraine and allow a neutral Ukraine to come up, Ukrainians would get their sovereignty, which they want passionately and should have. The Russians have their land bridge to Crimea, which they've essentially had for the last 250, 300 years. And the Americans get what they want. They want military and economic control of Eastern Europe and Western Europe. These are the realities that have come out of a year at war. And I believe that if you just look at it commonsensically, what I just said, which is essentially the Chinese proposal. The Chinese have just made a proposal, essentially saying what I have just articulated, that Ukraine needs to be considered neutral. Russia keeps what it has, but there's a larger security zone. And within the NATO-Russian context, there's the beginning of negotiations for an overarching security framework. That's what Gorbachev proposed. That's what the Americans and the British and the West Germans at that time, back in 1989, 1990, 1991, that's what everybody agreed. As Secretary of State James Baker put it, the NATO was not going to move an inch to the east. And on the basis of that, the two Germanys, East and West, were united. The solution is obvious. America just has to stand down. And that's the stark truth of where we are. Because if we do not, these superpowers, including China, are going to continue lumbering toward war. And all three of them have arsenals of nuclear weapons that each of which could destroy the earth many times over. We have to stop it. We need an immediate ceasefire. We need the activation of diplomacy. Somebody somewhere needs to speak out. Some spiritual leader like the Dalai Lama or the Pope, some political leader, particularly in Europe, which is being completely destroyed because of what's happening. It would be a tragedy beyond measure if after 5,000 years of civilization and everything that humanity has brought into the historical unfoldment of our species, that the last thing we do together is to initiate a global war over something as senseless as Ukraine. When if we simply understand what's happened, the solution is staring us into the face. We need a ceasefire. We need diplomacy. Or humanity may well commit suicide. We have to stop the march toward more war. The United States needs to stand down. We need a security arrangement that will preserve the peace and allow Americans and Russians and Chinese and Indians and Saudis and South Africans and Brazilians, all of us, to work on the real issues confronting us. And that is that our ecology is spinning out of control. So we have a stark choice of either a ceasefire, diplomacy, and peace, or an escalation that could bring us into nuclear exchange and the possible suicide of humanity at this most potentiated moment. Thank you, everyone. These are serious times worth grave reflection.